Hello, everyone, and welcome to Coastal Maine Voices, the new virtual series we've created for our supporters and fellow community members. So today, Island Institute President Rob Snyder will be discussing Maine's path forward with Hannah Pingree. Hannah is the director of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. But before we begin, I'd like to go over a few Zoom logistics with you all. So all attendees will remain on silent mode for the entire virtual event. If you have a question for Hannah or for Rob, go ahead and click that Q&A button and type your question in at any time. We have a dedicated Q&A segment at the end of this event where we'll try to get all of your questions answered. I also invite you to use the chat feature. You can say hi or tell us where you're zooming in from. It's up to you. Just remember to reserve those questions for the Q&A feature only. So now that we've taken care of that, let's get started. I'd like to begin by introducing Rob Snyder. Rob is the president of the Island Institute, and he will be your moderator for today. Take it away, Rob.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited that you're here for Coastal Maine Voices. I know we have folks here from all over the country, and we're going to have a great conversation with Hannah Pingree today. Hannah is as Farah noted, the director of the Governor's Policy Innovation in the Future Office, and also a longtime colleague. Hannah and I have been working together for years, and she's someone that I admire greatly for all of her accomplishments in the state and beyond. So, Hannah, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Rob. It is great to be here, and just on cue, your internet's getting spotty, so first of all, congratulations on helping to pass that broadband bond. Clearly, it's needed in the city of Rockland.
Thanks a ton, Hannah. We are incredibly excited that we've gotten $15 million from the state that we can use to advance broadband here. And we're actually really excited, too, that the governor is looking at part of the economic recovery plan to include another potentially up to $60 million for broadband investments. And I'm just kind of curious out on North Haven, how are you seeing people taking advantage of the internet out there, in addition to you being able to maybe do your job remotely? What else is going on out there to extend the way internet's impacting your economy?
Well, it's a great question. Obviously, I think all of us since March have realized just how important access to high-speed internet is. I'm incredibly lucky on North Haven that we actually have a pretty good infrastructure for most houses. Obviously, there are a couple of roads and a couple of people who are really frustrated by their lack of internet access. I would say that, like probably many people on this call, my kids' school went virtual in March. My job went virtual, as did many other people in the community. So clearly, from telemedicine to education to work, high-speed internet is proving pretty crucial to all of our lives. I would say that we certainly have seen in other parts of the state where this is not possible, and it's been a huge hindrance to economic activity, people's lives in general. So, and I would also say, this is summertime. There are probably more people here for longer because of access to high-speed internet. And so, while this pandemic has offered a ton of challenges, I think understanding how certain workers can work remotely more easily has actually been a positive, and it could be a positive going forward for rural, isolated communities that are trying to build their populations. People realize, oh wow, I actually could work from an offshore island or from Millinocket or many other parts of the state that people didn't used to think they could live in and still do their jobs.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of folks that are talking about actually staying here through the fall, staying into the winter, thinking about trying out their first Maine winter. We'll see how that goes, but I think that's a huge potential economic driver for Coast. And
winter is not that bad, Rob. And so, I mean, there's maybe the month of March is the month I would suggest. I wish we didn't go away this year, so it's for all of us in Maine. It's been a little rough. But I actually meant to mention there's some folks on North Haven who just bought our North Haven Grange and are converting it into a co-working space. So people who are visiting and people who live here year-round who don't have high-speed internet access could work from the island. So, I know Vinyl Haven has had a similar space to that. There are spaces like that all over the state. So I think that it has led to some creativity and some new business innovation.
I think that's going to happen here in Rockland too. I know the upper stories of these brick buildings have largely been vacant, and they're now being converted into nice residential units, rental units, so that people can come up here. And there's plans for a co-working space here in town as well. So I think this actually could bode very well for the state. It's unfortunate the terms that we're coming to this on, but I also just want to say, what's it been like in the state house as you've been trying to navigate this pandemic? I feel like from my experience of it, it's been, the leadership has been really strong and clear. So thank you for that, but I can't imagine the challenges it's created for you.
Yeah, I mean, I give a lot of credit to Governor Mills, who has had a huge job. I mean, I think governors of all 50 states are really confronted with the management of the pandemic, from, you know, public health decisions of openings and closings to dealing with the economic fallout that many communities are facing, to decisions about schools. So I would say I work in an office that helps to advise her on policy, and we look at long-term policy, but there's a lot of urgent needs. And so we've been, I'd say, since March 16th was the sort of day everyone went home, and we've really all been in an all hands on deck situation. You know, pitching in, my office has helped manage the Governor's Economic Recovery Committee. We've certainly supported some of the opening and closing issues, trying to help communicate better to the people of Maine about the challenges and how they get information. So it has been, you know, a lot of tough issues and people dealing with really, you know, challenging circumstances, whether it's their, you know, hospitality business, or, you know, teachers in schools trying to decide, you know, and figure out return to school this fall. I mean, there's so much on people's plates, and really the job of state government is to help guide people.
Well, you've done a fantastic job. The governor's done, I think, a really nice job of demonstrating what that looks like. And as a result, more people are going to want to move to Maine, because we are apparently this is one of the first times we've ranked at the top of national standings for something really positive, which is to be a safe place. So yep. I appreciate that. I know we all do.
I will say, I think we're all holding our breath. I think Maine has really been careful, and we have, you know, a rural nature that certainly helps protect public health. But I think a lot of the measures that we've taken have been helpful. I think we're all holding our breath. We're a couple weeks from the 4th of July, and the virus cases are still low, and we're one of the few states that has seen a decline. So I think we're feeling incredibly positive about what Maine is, but still know that the wave that's been sweeping the country could hit Maine still. But I do think that your point, I mean, you know, just last January, Maine was in a situation where our number one issue was workforce. How do we convince more people to move to the state of Maine? Because we have such an aging workforce. We have employers who cannot find enough qualified workers. So I definitely, you know, I think this pandemic has been mostly bad news, but certainly more people seeing Maine as a state in which it would be possible to do your job, as a safe place. That really is a positive.
Well, I hate to jump to something that's really a struggle in Maine from that, because I feel like that's really, in some ways it is very positive for Maine, what we're going to be able to make of this. But I also know that when we talked 2 Februaries ago, you and the governor had just created a special office to deal with the opioid crisis in Maine. And I know that in the first year of that work, there had been a significant trend towards declining cases or declining overdoses. And I know that certainly in my community, this is a big issue on my street. I've seen it, and I'm just curious, kind of what are you guys bracing for at the State House as the pandemic works its way into our economy more deeply this fall and next winter?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very timely. So I'm not an expert on opioids, but Gordon Smith, the governor's director of opioid response, is in my office. And so we support his work. He's actually having a statewide summit tomorrow that folks can tune into, and it is publicly accessible. Similar to last year's conference, it's really reviewing where the state has come on the issues of recovery and how do we do better. I would say Maine, like many states across the country, have actually seen a pretty alarming increase in overdoses. In the first quarter of this year, a report came out that that showed that, and obviously that's of significant concern to all of us. I know, Rob, you were just talking about even folks on your street who have been lost in the last couple of months. I think that the challenges of people being isolated, of economic dislocation, are significant. You know, Mainers already have a especially difficult time in the winter, and so I do think the Department of Health and Human Services and Gordon have really worked on, okay, how do we really ramp up recovery work? How do we get to people who are feeling isolated? How do we provide additional mental health support? How do we bolster this work at the community level? And it's a lot, and it's more needed than ever. And the challenge is that we are going to be facing likely a somewhat prolonged economic recession that will make these issues more difficult. And things like challenges in the lobster fishing industry, you know, other businesses, people being laid off, I mean, it only will serve to exacerbate. So it's an important time for focus and sort of ramping up support efforts, but it's also an important time for people to be vigilant and support each other, because, you know, that really is one of the most significant ways that we can try to at least improve the situation.
Yeah, well, I know that all of us are watching our friends and neighbors, and with a great deal of care and concern. And I feel like knowing that that office is doing the work it's doing has made a big difference, particularly for service center communities like ours that are really seeing an overwhelming impact, and I think are really concerned about what's to come. I guess I want to switch to something that I know you have been having a lot of fun with, and driving almost single-handedly with a huge group of volunteers across the private and public sector, the State Climate Council. You and the governor have set out really ambitious targets for the state of Maine, and I thought it might be helpful for folks to hear how you've been able to maintain momentum and even think about this moment of the pandemic, or this time of the pandemic, as a way to think about making progress on some of those climate council and state policy goals.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great question. I would say I appreciate the single-handed comment, but it is entirely inaccurate. Yeah. So first of all, I co-chair it with Jerry Reed, the Commissioner of Environmental Protection. And we have had, over the course of this winter, starting last September through this June, we had 230 Mainers on 6 different working groups and a science committee, all, you know, just putting in endless hours of meetings that were started as in-person, and in March moved to virtual Zoom meetings, which I think, as many people in this room, in this Zoom call, know is even more painful, who just really believe in the importance of the state addressing climate concerns. And they were diverse. They didn't all come to the table with the same opinion. Everything from, you know, truckers to environmentalists to you know, fishing groups to lots of scientists. All were trying to figure out what are the recommendations we have for Maine to tackle and create a 4-year action plan for climate, which is really one of the governor's top issues. So there, you know, the 2 big buckets of work are how do we reduce emissions, mitigate climate change, and then how do we prepare, how do we adapt and become more resilient? And both are huge pieces of work. I would say that, you know, our work did transition into a virtual space, and some people question, well, is this work really relevant still? But I think, you know, there are, just like the crisis we're dealing with now, climate is sort of a significant, if not growing, concern in people's minds, an issue where listening to science and dealing in facts is incredibly important. But unlike the pandemic, it is sort of a long-term project. It's not, you know, it's something that it's going to be, you know, 30 years of work to really get to where we need to be in terms of, you know, reducing our emissions and preparing our communities. So that's a long slog, and that's a more difficult, you know, it's a more difficult thing for people to wrap their minds around. When you see sea level rise, you know, you start to see erosion, but, you know, the projections are what's going to happen, you know, 70 years from now. It's harder for people to really to try to plan proactively. But I think, if anything, people have been more supportive than ever. They felt like this is an issue that is going to be important for Maine. It's an important issue for them to dive into. And I would say, you know, we're in a pandemic, but we're also in a recession, and climate and climate, strategies actually have a lot of economic potential for our state. From the forest products industry, where we're trying to figure out how to, make wood fiber insulation or cross-laminated timber for sort of the future of buildings, to incredible growth in renewable energy that we are seeing in Maine and requiring in Maine. I mean, that's job creation. So I do actually think that as we think about this recession, probably one of the more significant of many of our lifetimes, the opportunity to really build back in a way that is more sustainable is an opportunity.
What are you learning during the Climate Council process? I mean, first of all, I just want to say it's been appreciated by our organization to have 4 different people represented in those conversations on different parts of the council, and feel like we've had a real opportunity to bring island and coastal concerns to the table. But I am curious, kind of in the analyses that are going on right now, where are some of the biggest opportunities in Maine to actually get at some of the energy targets that you've identified?
Well, first of all, I'm not doing a very good job promoting. So everyone should go to climatecouncil.maine.gov, which is our new website, which really lays out all of the strategies that came out of the 6 working groups, and also ask people for their opinions. So we have surveys on the suggested strategies for people to tell us, good idea, won't work for my community, or here's another idea. So we really are actually spending the summer pushing to make sure people in Maine know what we're working on and have a chance to offer their opinion. I would say that there are, I think, nearly 40 strategies that were proposed, and some of those strategies are pretty complicated. I'd say there are the big pieces of work on reducing emissions are in the transportation sector, which is 54% of Maine's emissions. That's a sector that's a little harder for people to wrap their minds around, because I think the technology of EVs is emerging. But certainly, people understand fuel efficiency and saving money is a good thing. We are trying to find ways to help reduce commuting. And I think that access to high-speed internet, the ability to telecommute, and telemedicine is a way to help people drive less. How do we better plan our communities is a pretty challenging conversation in Maine. Land use issues have never been easy, but they're important on climate issues. I would say buildings are 30% of our emissions, so weatherizing them, making the ones we have more efficient, and then the new ones we build need to be way more efficient. And that's an issue where Suzanne McDonald at the Island Institute has been building storm windows and helping people weatherize homes for a long time, and that's work we really need to ramp up and put on overdrive, because I think we've been working away, and the islands have done some incredibly innovative work with efficiency, heat pumps, but there's a long ways to go. And then the big area is, where does our energy come from? And for our electricity sector, the state is required to have 80% renewable energy by 2030, which is an ambitious goal among all the states. The state's already at 40%. So how we build out, significant renewable energy generation in Maine is important. And then how do we transition transportation and buildings to be more reliant on electricity and not fossil fuels? And also things like wood products. There's renewable fuels that are going to be made out of wood products that offer an opportunity for Maine as well. So there's a lot of work. I mean, those are the big chunks on how do we reduce emissions.
Well, do you, so a lot of this in a way comes back to either our personal decision-making around our transportation choices, or kind of in what you were talking about, some pretty important municipal conversations about how are we going to plan and build out and invest in the future of our communities. Have you been thinking about how we help communities with that capacity for those conversations, and building that into what you anticipate the Climate Council will recommend for work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Rob, you've been on the front lines of that. I think the Island Institute's done a great job supporting communities in that kind of planning, but many other Maine towns, especially rural towns, don't have that same kind of infrastructure. Some parts of our state have strong, regional planning commissions, and then many other parts of our state don't have a lot. So I do think there's an entire sort of area of work and a number of recommendations that hit on how do we support communities? How do we support them in their resilience planning, you know, for sea level rise, flooding, storm events, emergency and public health issues? And how do we also help them reduce their carbon footprint? And again, communities have been on the front lines from, you know, Efficiency Maine just announced a bunch of schools getting LED light bulbs. Lots of towns have been doing solar projects. Casco Bay Lines just got awarded a new hybrid ferry. So I mean, I do think the work can't all be piecemeal. I mean, these examples are leading examples, but, you know, part of our project is how do we support the, you know, 450 plus towns in Maine to really have the tools they need to make these transitions. And what we found is like across the political spectrum, I mean, from very conservative rural towns to, you know, more liberal southern Maine towns, a lot of these changes, you know, are economically positive. They can reduce taxpayer funding for, you know, long-term utility bills, and they actually help attract citizens to communities, and every community wants to be vibrant. So I think that a lot of our work will be how do we support those tools and examples, and then there's state policy that needs to follow, certainly on, you know, to support land use planning, to support incentives, to support regional planning. But I do think that communities and schools, you know, as well as state government, we do need to lead the way, and I think a lot of Maine towns already are doing that.
Do you, I mean, I noticed that you took, I think it's noticeable that the lobster industry has a strong presence in the Climate Council. And I know that as an industry and through working with them over the years, they've become quite vocal about the way that climate change is impacting their industry. I'm just curious if you're hearing any ideas coming forward on that natural resource harvester side of things that you could imagine would be helpful, that would allow the industry to position itself for the future. We all see that it's under threat on a number of different fronts, and this seems like a real opportunity. You know, I know last year we worked to put solar power on one of the co-ops, and I know there's others looking at these kinds of options. So yeah, what are you, I'm curious, you know, aside from it being your friends and neighbors, you know, and our coastal economy, what brought you to bring the lobster industry so close to the conversation?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, the lobster industry is an important one for Maine. It's iconic. It's, you know, potential transition already over time. The fact that it's transitioned more offshore is attributable to climate issues. I mean, I think everyone's heard the statistic about Maine's Gulf of Maine warming 99% faster than any other, you know, ocean body in the world. So I think, you know, lobsters and the lobster industry is not only economically important, but it's really kind of a symbol of Maine. And so, you know, we have people on the council, also in the forest products industry. But I think that it really is essential that their voices are a part of it. And I think, again, you know, we've had so many examples of fishing communities that are worried about change, that are worried about the economic change that's going to happen if we see a downturn in lobstering. So I think the Climate Council was, we specifically have a coastal and marine working group, and everything from what happens to wharves that may be impacted by sea level rise to how do we diversify, how do we prepare for potential changes in the kinds of species that will be caught in the Maine Ocean, and how do we get on the sort of front lines of that regulation. I think that really there are a number of proactive strategies that I think are essential. Patrice McCarron, who's the head of the Maine Lobstermen's Association, is one of the 39 Climate Council members. And I think, you know, she understands these issues pretty deeply, and, you know, everything from how do we support diversification, how do we support more research, to how do we deal with an issue like offshore wind that is a huge economic opportunity, a huge renewable energy opportunity, but clearly is something that's going to need careful negotiation with fishing. So there are a lot of issues at play, and some of them are incredibly daunting and challenging. And clearly, as you know, Rob, I've got lots of friends who are lobstermen. They certainly don't all agree. And even the ones who maybe would say, I don't even believe in climate change, but yes, the ocean is changing and species are changing and they're moving for some reason, I think really is an acknowledgement that there is environmental change happening that we need to be proactive in thinking about, and not just sort of you know, 20 years down the road when there's catastrophic changes, suddenly realize like, what are we going to do? So, I mean, you mentioned the Cranberry Isle Co-op that went solar. I know Luke's Lobster has been a real pioneer and is working on some potentially cool projects with you at the Island Institute. So I think, again, seeing pioneering pilots, seeing that this is an industry where people want a product that, you know, a lot of people are making climate friendly decisions now. So this is a local product, and obviously relying on only shipping it to China is challenging right now in this trade circumstance. So I think clearly it's an important area of focus.
Well, so you brought up offshore wind, not me. So I'm going to go there as well. It's a big focus and priority for your office. And I'm curious, and I know Searsport's currently reviewing its potential as a assembly and deployment site. You know, can you provide an update for our listeners about where the conversation on offshore wind stands at this time?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, in many ways, Maine is behind. Most of the, you know, northeastern states have already gone out with procurements of offshore wind projects. Most of those projects haven't been built, but a lot of those projects are now in the pipeline for being permitted. Permitting of offshore wind is primarily a federal project, and it's been an incredibly slow undertaking. Right now, Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire are collaborating on a task force to just consider potential offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, which obviously the Gulf of Maine goes into waters well south of Maine. I think the governor sees offshore wind as an economic opportunity and a huge renewable energy opportunity for Maine. I had the opportunity with Dan Burgess, the director of the governor's energy office, to go to Scotland with the governor just weeks before this pandemic and witness really like an absolute transformation of their energy economy. Tons of onshore and offshore wind generating so much power that they're turning it into hydrogen, which they're using to power their cars and houses. You know, it has been, it's a transition of their oil industry into a totally new industry that's producing thousands of jobs. So I think many people have probably heard Maine's, the University of Maine has developed an offshore wind floating platform. And when launched, this first demonstration site off Monhegan, it will be the first floating offshore wind platform in the US. So, you know, it's an R&D opportunity for Maine. If this really proves to be commercially viable, you know, it will be a huge job creator for the state if we can build these things in Maine, and I think that we can. So I would say all that it's you know, offshore wind generates a ton of energy, and Maine has a great wind resource. I think Angus King called us the Saudi Arabia of wind. But clearly there are fishing interests that really need to be carefully managed. You know, I foresee that most of Maine's offshore wind, which is, you know, many years in the future beyond this one pilot site, will be, you know, really 30 miles out. That's at least a prediction. There are people who fish that far out, but there are not that many. So I think really choosing sites carefully, figuring out who you're gonna impact and how you can negotiate that is most important. So the fishing industry, I think, is sort of the #1 group at the table, but also, you know, other marine interests, maritime interests, you know, other species, they're all important. So I know the governor wants to get it right, but I think she also sees incredible economic opportunity. I mean, the state of New York just launched huge new offshore wind procurement yesterday. So I think we're all kind of in a race to figure out how to do this.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you kind of 2 more questions before we go to the Q&A from the audience. But one thing, just one last piece on the Climate Council and your work there. You know, I know that oftentimes kind of the recovery from disasters or the opportunity for a new economic future leaves people who are already marginalized further behind. And, you know, I wrote a piece not too long ago about kind of how can we become more welcoming as a state. And I feel like, and I know that the Climate Council has been dealing with criticism and thinking through kind of how to create a more inclusive process. And so I just wondered if you could say something about the work that's being done there and what you're learning from it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We're actually currently working with the University of Maine Mitchell Center on an equity audit of the recommendations that have come forward so far. And, to me, I think everything from, new Mainers to tribal communities to, rural senior drivers to, there's lots of different groups who really need to have their interests considered because climate is going to have impacts. It's going to have economic impacts. The solutions will have impacts. And we need to make sure that those impacts are not disproportionate. And in many past policies in the US and elsewhere, certainly the challenges of, bad environmental choices have really fallen disproportionately on poor communities, many of whom are minority communities. So I think that, these issues are they've always been relevant. They're incredibly relevant in Maine. And I think in many ways for Maine, some of the benefits from weatherizing homes and incentives for new heating systems to the kinds of jobs we're going to produce, those benefits really need to be felt across the board. How do we make sure tribal communities feel the benefit? How do we make sure low-income Mainers can be retrained for better paying jobs? So those are issues we're really focused on, and it really is about, the governor has said in her first inaugural address, it was really all about like welcome home. How do we make our state more welcoming for people across the board? And that's also key to, I think, the economic growth in our state. So I sort of see these two issues coming together. And I think if handled carefully and seriously, I think we have an opportunity to make policy that will be good for all of Maine, and especially good for those in Maine who've traditionally been left behind.
I think that's fantastic to hear, Hannah. I know as an organization, we've really been looking at ourselves and asking questions about how we can do this work too and be a part of that conversation. And I appreciate that you invited one of our team to be on that Mitchell team as a part of this. So I think that'll help us with the work we're trying to do here on the coast. So I appreciate that. The last thing I want to ask about is really just a bit of a personal question, reflecting back on this time of the pandemic. I feel like we've seen all different ways in which leadership has shown up in this pandemic, and we've seen people who haven't. And I'm curious, kind of as a leader yourself, somebody who's been in public office for years, what have you learned, if anything, about yourself during this time? And what have you seen in your community or at the State House that's kind of evidence of courageous or resilient leadership? And the reason I'm asking is I think it's fair to say that going forward, the number one way that communities are going to survive and become stronger is their ability to actually manage change. Bigger changes, more unpredictable changes, faster. And so what do you think you're seeing? What have you seen in yourself that you think speaks to the hope that we can bring to a faster changing world?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, a hard question. I mean, I would say change in Maine has traditionally been quite challenging, and yet the world around us is changing. I mean, our economy is changing. This pandemic has caused, obviously just overnight change. Issues like climate offer both change and like requirements to change if we're really going to keep up. So I would say, personally, I grew up on North Haven. I live on North Haven. I'm here right now working remotely. And I think small island communities and small rural communities in Maine are generally having a sort of all hands on deck approach. If no one's coming to help us fix our problems, we've got to manage them ourselves. And I think that this pandemic has proven that true as well. And, without getting overly political, certainly for states, they've kind of been on their own, having to do everything from manufacturing masks to, even in Maine, I would say, I think of visionary leadership. I think of a company like IDEX that's really stepped up and is now the state's key partner in a testing strategy that's working. And tests that are being performed in Maine are being turned around in 2 days and not 7 to 10 days. And so I think, from everything from the companies who are stepping up to the companies who are really innovating to hold on to their workers, to, I've seen people across state government who just are working never ending hours to try to figure out how to manage this problem and make people's lives better. So, I mean, even on North Haven, we had a very high profile example of incredibly proactive leadership. And, some people thought it was too proactive, but I think, people really view how do we manage this challenge as a problem that they wanted to be as hands-on as possible in trying to address. So I guess I would say, we've certainly seen lots of not great examples either, and negativity and people kind of lacking some of this communal spirit. But I guess I would say overall, I think the majority of Mainers really do support kind of more communal efforts of how do we support each other, how do we act like a small town, which Maine really is, even as a state, and how do we keep that spirit, but then figure out how to innovate in our economy. And again, that will require some change. Again, that change is hard, but I think that Mainers will step up, and I think that this pandemic and sort of seeing people's reaction to it actually gives me hope.
That's fantastic. I think there's no question that I'm seeing, well, just in the last decade, people used to try to answer most of the questions that they were confronted with in their own community with the resources they immediately had access to. And just the shift to looking outward, looking for information that you can trust from multiple places, the strength of being connected and networked. I think all those things are what's making this coast, the communities that are working well right now appear to be the communities that are really interested in and have spent time getting connected. I've seen, it's been really helpful to see people who worked on the broadband issue in their communities show up as a network that was focused on broadband to focus on the pandemic and what needs to be done there. Or to see ferry operators who hadn't been working together, private ferry operators getting on the phone together and saying, all right, how are we going to share resources and show up for our communities? So I think there's a lot in what you said that I hear ringing true all along the coast.
Yeah,
and
I would even say, I've even seen, the requirement for state government to collaborate and the requirement to work more closely with, Maine municipal associations and cities and towns. I think the issues have been so urgent, it's required us to work together, but I think that's, as you just said, going to build relationships that will serve us for other future problems that hopefully will pale in comparison.
I sure hope so. I will just say quickly, the way that this state government has really brought the private sector to the table to help solve problems is notable and distinct and been incredibly effective. So glad to see that. So I'm going to go to the questions. We have a few here and we have a little bit of time. So I'm going to start with one. It says, thanks for your participation. My name is Owen and I'm a year-rounder on Peaks Island. I'm 34 and moved to Maine a year ago. Lots of my friends from Brooklyn and Boston want to move up to Maine, but continue to face challenges finding tech-forward, innovative jobs to ignite our capabilities. So the question is, how do we convince tech companies from the Bay Area to move satellite offices to the state of Maine?
It's a great question. I know I've been working closely with the Governor's Economic Recovery Committee, which is chaired by Josh Broder of Tilson, and I do think we actually have some pretty interesting tech companies, but we want more. And I think those are jobs that are good paying jobs. They're good for Maine young people. So creating an environment that encourages that, and really, creating livable communities. Things like, cities and towns that people want to live in, housing opportunities that allows them to stay here will help. I will say, I've heard, you may have opinions on these companies, but Twitter and Facebook and a number of the other large tech companies have now kind of universal remote work policies, and some of them are going all remote. I think that's going to be the way of the world. And I think that's not the only solution. We clearly want to grow companies in Maine as well in these sectors, but I do think that presents an opportunity for people to kind of live anywhere. They just need access to high-speed internet. I will say that the RU Institute, if you haven't heard of it, part of Northeastern University, is just ramping up in the Portland area, and it's really all about training people for STEM careers, from biotech to AI to engineering. And so I think it's offering master's level programs, and I think as we see that ramp up, as well as other higher ed institutions in Maine, it really is giving people higher skill levels. That's what is going to help bring more jobs to Maine, bring more companies to Maine, and companies that are looking for where to locate need a skilled workforce. So Owen, tell your friends to move here and/or start companies. You know, there's lots of remote working opportunities as well, but clearly we do want those companies to be based in Maine or have at least offices here.
I mean, the ways that I've seen at a smaller scale a lot of this happening is certainly around digital media and storytelling. There's a company that's working in Portland called Yarn that's also based in California. You know, I feel like that is part of what Maine has as a strong suit. We are a state of storytellers, and there are a lot of really innovative digital platforms being developed here to operate in virtual reality and other ways of storytelling that build off of that aspect of Maine's culture. So I think between just those small examples and some of the bigger ones you're providing, Hannah, we have to figure this out. It's definitely going to be a great part of our economic future. Here's a different question that's related to workforce. Perhaps this, well, I'll just skip that, but okay. Perhaps
while you're looking, I did see in chat pop up Kathy Warren, formerly of Vinyl Haven, now at the Maine DOE, lobbying me that the Maine DOE is doing a lot too. So I would say they just launched, I think it's called Moose, is their new website where teachers in Maine can create these online virtual units for people all over the country to take advantage of. And there is a lot of innovation happening in online education. I think we all know that's not all we want for our kids. I'm trying to steal my screens away from my son every hour of the day, but there's certainly
Me too.
a ton of opportunity.
So this question's a great one. Maybe this isn't the perfect time to address this issue, but the best source of future workforce is going to need to include more immigrants. Are there any plans afoot to enhance the process for welcoming more immigrants to Maine?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you wrote about that, Rob, in one of your opinion pieces recently. I think that's part of the governor has really started that with her messaging of, you know, welcome home. How do we need to be a welcoming state for diverse people? You know, how are we more welcoming for immigrants? Honestly, how can Maine be more welcoming for people from any state in the country? Because we are a state that you can live in Maine your whole life and you're still not a Mainer. So, you know, even those jokes aside, I think it is important that we all think about this attitude as we try to figure out how to grow more vibrant communities. I would say state government has certainly worked to be proactive on, you know, everything from how do we help people who have a degree in another country transfer that and get certified in their potential occupation in Maine. So there are those kind of barriers. I would say the welcoming of people from away is kind of a national challenge right now with the current administration, and that's not helpful for a country that needs to grow and needs new workers. But I think hopefully Maine can have an opportunity. I think a lot of our rural communities do present challenges. I mean, I've worked with, you know, folks who are not white, and they say it's not easy to be in a community, you know, very all white community in Maine where there's nobody else who looks like you. I mean, that is a challenge. And so I think this will not be an easy issue to overcome, but I think we're having serious conversations in Maine and certainly across the country that are requiring people to think more deeply about these issues. And I know the governor's taking it seriously. And hopefully we can move these conversations to more action that will make a difference in people's lives. Because again, we need to be welcoming. Maine, when this pandemic ends, will still be among the oldest states in the country. We will still lack adequate workforce, and we will, you know, still need to figure out new ways to diversify to attract workers to Maine. And immigrant workers have proved to be really resourceful and huge fueling forces for our economy already.
I guess I'm going to ask, thank you, Hannah. The pandemic has created all sorts of negative impacts and challenges. We're also learning and connecting in new ways. What, if anything, would Hannah want to take? What's the thing you would want to take with you as kind of as from this experience when you think about what it is you've learned that you'd want to carry forward?
I mean, there's small things. I mentioned some of them at the beginning, you know, belief in science, big things like the ability to telecommute and move things online, you know, that those are important lessons. I will say Dr. Shaw did I'm sure everyone knows who Dr. Shah is. The very famed Maine Dr. Shah did a presentation at the Maine Climate Council recently, and I think he really talked about a communal sense that we're all in this together and we need to work together to figure out how to solve problems. And it's more important than ever. You know, in a pandemic, we're now all relying on each other to wear masks, to try to, you know, figure out how to, you know, increase your hygiene so you can protect people around you. You know, we're relying on state government to, you know, to make lots of decisions that will protect kids, protect industries. So I think the communal sense of we can solve big problems is probably the most important. And I certainly will not say that we've solved this pandemic. I think we're all trying to learn together how to manage it. But I think if we can take that, you know, we are not all in this alone. We need to figure out how to work together to make big things happen. You know, that's probably the most important thing.
Great. So I've got a good one here. It says, thank you for your presentation, Hannah, and thank you so much for your advocacy. What are the implications of Maine's Climate Council's work for secondary school programming in your mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, it's not an issue that I would say we have not spent enough time on it. The Maine Department of Education has done some good work on STEM education and climate and science units that we've been collaborating with them on that. I actually just met with a group of diverse high school students who are focused on climate and nature-based education. They were lobbying us, you know, how do we really take this up a notch? Because kids in school from elementary to high school are more passionate about this topic really than most adults. And they want it to be more part of their curriculum. They want their schools to be making a difference. They want their towns to be making a difference. So we've been really trying to figure out how to, you know, listen to these students and figure out what to do next. I think, you know, the move to put more solar on schools has been led by high school students. So, you know, taking that leadership and that enthusiasm and, you know, making it a part of, you know, education and curriculum is important. And I know that a lot of educators in Maine are talented on this subject and want to do more. So hopefully we can find a way to highlight their work. I can't say it specifically is a major part of any of our Climate Council recommendations, but it's been kind of an area that I would imagine is going to come up in some way and be more substantial.
I've got a couple more questions before we wrap up. And the first one is from Revision Energy. It says, so this is a person who works in the solar industry. And the question is, what can we do on a state level to help build infrastructure without profits going out of the state or out of the country to other utilities?
I mean, obviously there's a lot of politics in that current question about what's happening with the power line and what's happening with some of the other states' utilities. I would say, I think big picture, one of the Climate Council's recommendations so far coming out of the Energy Committee is how do we both transform our power sector and figure out ways to pay for it, because a lot of these transitions, some of them save us money, but certainly some of them require infrastructure investments that we have to figure out how to finance, and finding lower cost capital to finance it. You know, not just relying on some of the big banks, but figuring out, you know, state bonding authority. Certainly the state of Connecticut has done a lot with their green bank. So we are looking at a bunch of different models for some of this more significant work. And I'd say right now, all options are on the table. I mean, I live in a town that is, you know, run by a consumer-owned utility, and it's been a great model. So I think there's lots of ideas out there. They all bring incredible amount of politics but they're all on the plate right now, as Revision knows. And I think that we're taking them all seriously.
Thank you. Well, so the last question that I'll ask is really, so this one's from me. I'm going to ask us to think ahead about a time in the not too distant future where municipal revenues are challenged, where school budgets are having difficulty passing, and with the anticipation, at least, that there will be future federal support. Let's certainly hope that there will be some help coming along the way. You know, aside from broadband, which I'm sure will be at the top of every list that goes from here on out, because we're going to work hard on hoping that it is that way. Where do you see the opportunities for relief packages to be deployed in Maine to actually help us survive what could be a really dark couple of years with the recession that's weighing down on us?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Rob. It's very relevant to folks reading the newspaper about what's happening in Washington right now. I mean, right now they're considering, kind of urgent relief for people. Hopefully, states, certainly schools, those questions are all on the table. And then we've all been hopeful that there would be a more significant package to support economic recovery. Both coming out of Washington, maybe something also being considered in Maine. And I'd say a lot of it it goes to this concept of how do we really rebuild in a more sustainable way. And I think that significant infrastructure projects and small infrastructure projects offer a lot of opportunity, from building ferry boats to rebuilding roads and bridges, building, new technology like EV charging. Weatherizing homes is, certainly a lot of the money that came out of kind of jumpstarting that work in 2009 came out of a federal recovery package where, the Efficiency Maine Trust was really able to start programs to weatherize homes, eventually to install heat pumps and new technologies. So I would really hope that the Congress and the state would consider that kind of investment. And there's a lot of less sexy things, like we have many wastewater treatment plants on the coast that need to be rebuilt for both climate and other reasons. But those are long, those are good paying jobs and a lot of jobs to do that kind of work. I mean, the same is true with our energy grid. So I mean, and clearly if we're able to do all those things, we have a stronger infrastructure for our economy and our states and our communities for the long term. So we're certainly lobbying for that. We encourage everyone to talk to their members of Congress about similar efforts, because I just think that kind of investment is needed. The state and country has not done a good job of it over the last 20 or 30 years, and it shows, and it really could put the U.S. and Maine and our communities in a much better place.
Well, thank you, Hannah. I just want to say I really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this Coastal Maine Voices conversation. Every time we get to talk, I learn a lot, and I think it is just really heartening to know that we have leadership like you informing the governor's perspective and making sure that somebody is really watching out as a partner for the future of the coast. For folks who are joining us, Hannah's been working her whole life for a coast she cares deeply about. And she at one point even served as a board member of the Island Institute. And so, and having Hannah as your boss is a real treat, let me tell you. So,
Sure.
So thank you so much, Hannah. And I'm going to thank everybody who's joined. For all of you who are supporters of the Island Institute, it's much appreciated. For those of you who aren't supporters, please sign up and make a gift to the Island Institute so that we can continue to fight for the broadband issue, for diversifying the marine economy, and for the climate work that we're doing. It's all critical to these communities' futures. And we're doing it in strong partnership with the state and with community leaders. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Farah and ask her to walk us out.
All right, thanks, Rob. I'd like to conclude by thanking Hannah and Rob for that important discussion on Maine's future. If you have any follow-up questions to this event, go ahead and email membership@islandinstitute.org, and myself or the most appropriate person will follow up with you. We'll also be sending out a recording of this conversation to you via email in about 24 hours, so keep an eye out for that. All right, everyone. Well, thank you again for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed our summer series, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.